Really happy to introduce a kind of a panel of esteemed specialists from industry. One of the big things that we thought about, so when Marzi and I first thought about this, how do we put this thing together? What are the things that really interest people? One of the things we wanted to make sure that we target is how do we make sure that machine learning is actually applied in a practical sense? Because we hear a lot about kind of research being done and kind of these applications that are out there, but not an understanding of how do you move from cutting edge research all the way to actually deploying it with clinicians in practice with experts on the helm. And so with that, I'd love to introduce my panelists. If I can ask you all to come up and take a seat, I'll introduce them one by one. So first we have Dr. Kamran Khan. He is an infectious disease physician with training in public health and preventive medicine based at the Li Ka-shing Institute at St. Mike's. He's an associate professor in the Division of Infectious Disease at the Dalla Lana School of Public Health and the Institute for Health Policy Management and Evaluation. And his research interests focus on human migration, international travel, and the impact of globalization on newly emerging and re-emerging infectious diseases. He's also the founder of a social enterprise called BlueDot that involves innovative web and mobile technologies to facilitate smart and timely decisions by individuals and health organizations. And that's what we're hoping he can tell us more about today in terms of how he's actually applied machine learning within BlueDot to create an impact for the people that we serve. And then second, we have Dr. Sonny Kohli, who is an internal medicine physician and is a faculty member at the McMaster University. Sonny is also, this is an interesting fact I found out as I was doing my research on him, was a top 40 astronaut candidate in the Canadian Space Agency. And while studying at the International Space University, he actually helped deploy the image reversal in space experiment on the International Space Station. So bona fide astronaut here. Amazing. Okay. Sonny also co-founded a CloudDX, which is made to create a fully autonomous digital doctor called Vitality. Sonny and CloudDX were bestowed the XPRIZE for first ever bold epic innovator as part of the Qualcomm tricorder XPRIZE competition. And finally, at the far end, we have Dr. Douglas Queen, world-renowned wound expert and researcher, and he co-founded the International Wound Journal alongside Dr. Keith Harding in 2004. And he brings with him 30 years of international expertise in commercial development, market access, and medtech R&D. He's worked for a number of independent medical device as an independent medical device consulting specializing in wound care field for the past 20 years. And during that time, he's advised large multinational companies and smaller startup companies in the areas of commercial development and market access. At Swift Medical, which is where Douglas is now, he leads the commercial development activities, including commercialization and productization of data technologies. So please help me in welcoming our esteemed panelists to the Unconference. All right, so the first thing we're going to do is I'm going to give each of you 3 minutes, starting with Kamran on this end, to tell us about your company, your product, and how you've used machine learning to create an impact.
Perfect. Okay, let me just see if it's on. Now it's on. Okay. Well, good morning, everyone. Ahmed, thanks for the introduction and for inviting me to be part of this forum here. I think maybe before I jump into the details about what we're doing at BlueDot, I'll just provide a bit of context as to, in terms of the inspiration behind what we're doing. So 16 years ago, some of you might remember, I was actually just moving to Toronto after finishing my training in infectious diseases and public health, and this virus that nobody had ever seen or heard of before showed up here in our city and crippled the city for about 4 months. And that was really a pretty profound experience for me to see. A couple of colleagues I know got infected with SARS. This was a multi-billion-dollar economic hit to the city, and we were just one of dozens of cities around the world that were going through this type of experience. Now, as a physician specializing in infectious diseases and in public health, if there was one person who should have known that perhaps there was something going on in Guangdong province in China, it'd probably be me. But we didn't actually even know what this was until it showed up in our hospitals. And so that was really kind of, for me, a bit of an aha moment of realizing, we often think about health in a more localized context, but we're not necessarily thinking about health in terms of how we're so interconnected, how our health is so interdependent today. And ultimately, really, back 16 years ago, I started to think about, we really need a global early warning system for infectious diseases so that all of us can have a better understanding of what's out there, what risks does this pose to us, and how should we be responding. So I spent about a decade in, purely in the academic arena, just studying global outbreaks and, how could we better detect them using digital tools? How could we anticipate their spread through the world's air travel? And then 5 years ago, I ended up founding BlueDot. At BlueDot, basically, we're building this, what I'm going to call a global early warning system for infectious diseases. So I'm going to just describe one of the 3 pillars of this early warning system, and it's really about disease surveillance. So, I think many of us just envision that that countries will report when they are experiencing an outbreak, and that the rest of us will know this in a timely fashion. Well, it turns out that that isn't always the case. In many instances, it can take weeks or sometimes even months before a country has declared that they're experiencing an outbreak. And in some situations, there's actually even active suppression of this information because there may be economic or other consequences. So increasingly, the internet has become a medium for gathering information about infectious diseases. It could be the media writing about something happening in a particular community. It could be online forums. But all of this information, as you can imagine, it's a massive amount of information. It's in hundreds of different languages. It's all unstructured. And it's just coming out kind of all over the place. Now, Canada was really a pioneer in developing something called GFIN a few years back. Actually, it's probably going almost 20 years now. The Global Public Health Intelligence Network, developed by the Canadian government, and it's basically a system that is scraping, news about plague and anthrax and other types of infectious diseases from the web. But what that really created was a massive haystack of data, and that haystack is just getting bigger and bigger and bigger all the time. And it required a large number of individuals who spoke multiple languages to be able to then read this information, translate it, and then say, is this an outbreak of anthrax, or is this the reunion of the heavy metal band Anthrax? And then to classify all that information and then put that out there so that the rest of the global community can actually understand what's going on. So one of the things that we're doing at BlueDot is we have basically been using machine learning and natural language processing. So our engineers have developed tools to scrape this text through, Google News, through a whole bunch of different online forums, tens of thousands of different sites, and then to actually classify the information. I won't spend the next minute describing the details that might come later, but to classify this information so we know this is a real outbreak. It may be unverified, but it's being reported in this particular area. This is about an infectious disease, but it doesn't have anything to do with an outbreak. It may be about a new drug development or the economic impact of a disease. And this is about something, the word plague is used in a way that has nothing to do with plague from an infectious disease perspective. So we have been building these tools and building this surveillance engine, which feeds in all of our products. And now those products are deployed in 12 countries for supporting government agencies, CDC, WHO, the Canadian government, 10 countries in Asia. But increasingly, we're also seeing that there's interest from defense and security organizations as it relates to bioterrorism risks. And to my surprise, which is why I founded BlueDot, that companies, airlines, travel and tourism, insurance companies that want to protect the health of their policyholders. There are so many other forums where this type of intelligence is needed. And so at BlueDot, what we've been doing is, surveillance is just one of the pillars, but integrating and feeding this surveillance into our products to help support timely and location-specific insights for our various clients and partners.
Thank you very much.
Oh, you've got it.
No, I'll take that just in case. Wow, Cam. So that's a I guess a good segue into what I'm doing. I guess I'll follow your lead, and I wasn't going to tell the story, but I'll speak to my aha moment, and then talk about the company that I'm involved with and some of the work that we're doing as it relates to this conference. So I'm an internist and an intensivist, like Dr. Jeffrey Larson, who just spoke, but I'm an adult intensivist. And the nice thing about being an intensivist, we don't have a shingle on a door, and we're in the clinic day in, day out, which doesn't afford us opportunities to do other things. And as an intensivist, we can walk away from the ICU when we're not on service. And so as a result, I was taking a lot of opportunities to do with global health, working during the the tsunami in Indonesia and during the earthquake in Haiti. And in Haiti, I, like Cameron, had an aha moment when I was caring for a patient. She was an NGO, an American volunteer, who came to our volunteer hospital at the time. And it wasn't saying much about her hospital, but it was the most modern hospital at the time, but there was no infrastructure, so there was nothing left of the existing hospitals in Port-au-Prince. So we were it. And what I realized is, for her to get to her hospital, overcoming all the obstacles that she had to face, a crime-infested suburb, the rubble of the earthquake, her own impediments, she was having chest pain, and to get the care she needed was quite a journey. And could we use newly emerging digital tools and the emerging infrastructure that is the cloud to help augment and improve her ability to get the care she needed without having to be geographically placed in our hospital? And so I had that aha moment. Mine was over cheap Haitian beer one night in Port-au-Prince, where I thought maybe we could develop a simple tool like an ECG and partner it with a phone and some cloud-based technology to facilitate diagnosis remotely. And so off I went on a startup journey, created a startup, created the product, and the startup failed because I'm fundamentally a physician and not a businessman. And after that, I did meet a group of co-conspirators, many of whom were business-minded and marketers and data scientists, and we embarked on this new journey to create the world's first tricorder, which I'm dating myself, but if you remember the Star Trek show, and Dr. McCoy would use the tricorder, that premise, that concept, which is 60 years old, where we could actually supply care remotely and improve operational efficiencies, improve outcomes, but providing timely care, leveraging digital tools. It was not a new concept, but it was a new competition. And we were very fortunate as the only Canadian company to win an XPRIZE with our tricorder. And from that was founded CloudDX, a company that, well, we realized that problem's not a global one. That woman in Haiti fundamentally has similarities to people here in Toronto, getting to your doctor on a cold, wintry day in Toronto when you have to get on the rocket. That's not a pleasant experience. And for those in our remote regions and rural areas of Canada, how can we increase access to care for them or keep them out of the hospital as an extension of that? So CloudDX, like BlueDot, has several pillars to our organization. Fundamentally, the problem we're solving right now in Canada, the real world problem, and one of the reasons why I've been invited to this panel, is can we keep people with chronic illness out of Canadian hospitals, improve their outcomes, improve their quality of life, while lowering costs for their healthcare journey. And so we're really focused on chronic illnesses that are very commonplace and probably the biggest burden on our healthcare system, which are CHF, congestive heart failure, and COPD, or chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. And so out of that, we, in addition to the tricorder that we've built that we're, soon to be getting approved by Health Canada, the FDA, it's nothing more than a fancy neck wearable and some powered by machine learning and artificial intelligence to drive outcomes. We have an existing suite of tools and devices that are nothing more than some peripherals that you would see at the drugstore that are Bluetooth integrated to a tablet, and all of that data can be taken to a cloud-based platform, and then that data can be utilized. So the key to that platform is not the peripheral devices, because they're not very fancy, but the data infrastructure and how we can leverage that data to provide insights to the care providers. So that's where we're focused on right now at CloudDX. And fortunately, that we're being very innovative in addressing the problem, and we're willing to take a chance and take a flat, and as Dante said, bet down on us and take a chance in our technology. And through a lot of failings, we finally found success, and so here we are today.
Hi, how many people in the audience have heard of wounds? Hands up. Public perception of wounds is a small cut you put a Band-Aid on. How many people believe that? That's generally what the public believe, until they get a chronic wound that lasts for a long time. The difficulty we faced when we started Swift Medical was that they had a vision in respect of they were looking at a non-clinical area where they used their visioning technology to measure something and get its dimensions. They came across a clinician who was doing a residency, and part of her residency was looking after patients with wounds. She was a young person, so she was a millennial, so technology was at the forefront of her mind. And when she came on board and she was in the clinic, and she realized that she had to take a paper ruler and she had to hold it against the wound, and she had to make her best guess of the length and width, and then had to do a calculation. As a millennial, she was horrified. Absolutely horrified. So she came across the 3 founders of the company, and she said to them, "This is great technology, but I don't care what you want to photograph in your mind. I want you to photograph wounds." And that's essentially where Swift's journey started. So she took it into the clinic with the co-founders, and they started to use it on wounds. The irony is that most patients, and for the clinicians in the panel and clinicians in the audience, if you do deal with wounds, the patient themselves takes a picture of their wound with their phone on an ongoing basis, probably on a daily basis, or depending on how often their dressing's changed, and they bring it along to the doctor and they go, look, this is what's been going on. But in the medical fraternity, that wasn't done. So basically, Swift's seen a gap in the marketplace. Another irony of its initial journey was they were, this is easy, patient app. We'll develop a patient app. The patient's already taken pictures of their wounds, and then they can do it much more scientifically, and they can bring it along, and we'll get data out of it. Wrong. That wasn't really where they should have started, because for most of the patients, they're not interested in all of the other stuff that goes along with the photograph. And when it comes to the clinician, what's the biggest obstacle? Putting into their records. And the privacy concerns that when you're taking a picture of a wound and it belongs to the patient takes it themselves and cares to share it with you and their family, that's okay. So one of the biggest challenges they then had was, how do you fit it into a clinician's workflow? The next challenge was, just like the previous speaker who was talking about the ICU, there is a specialty in regards of ICU. There is no clinical specialization for wound care. There is nothing called woundology or whatever Greek term medics want to actually pick up. There isn't. Most of these patients, it's fragmented care, and they're seen moved from pillar to post, and dependent on the comorbidities they have, they may be seen by another kind of specialist who sees the wound and says, well, I better do something about that when I'm seeing the patient. But they're more than happy to pass that on to someone else when they get to that end. So that fragmentation of care was another problem for Swift. How do you connect all of the elements of healthcare so that you get a consistent record without gaps? So I won't say too much because I know some of the questions are coming along, but it was definitely an evolutionary journey for Swift, both from an application perspective, but also from a machine learning perspective.
Great. Well, thank you very much for telling us about each of your organizations and how you've kind of identified this need that you've then gone to market and found solutions for. One of the things I think is a pressing question of our time is actually around data collection. So we keep hearing about how data is being collected from all kinds of places, from our apps, from our phones, sometimes with our permission, sometimes without our permission. And so there's this big question of, how do you actually do this the right way? What steps do you take to ensure that you're collecting this data ethically? And that's been a big concern of organizations like ours at Trillium, that are looking at these massive amounts of data and making sure that we're using them in an ethical fashion. So I'd love to hear from, starting with Kamran and then maybe some of the other panelists. What approach did you take to ethically collect the data that you needed to build your models? And can you give us an example of some of the challenges that you've overcome to be able to achieve that?
I think my situation is going to be a little bit different. Because the example I'm talking about here is how we're collecting open source data and how we're making sense of data across many different languages. So we aren't dealing with the same kinds of issues that Sonny or Douglas would be dealing with in terms of patient information. But just in the interest of broader transparency, maybe I'll talk about how we use data. I mean, we are also taking our approaches, we are publishing on the approaches that we have used to process data, so that's kind of largely in giving people some confidence about how we're managing the data, the insights that we're generating. But we haven't really had the same kind of issues. So I might actually hand it over to Sonny to talk a little bit about this, because I suspect he'll have a very different perspective on this.
So yeah, fundamentally, when I talked about the pillars of our company, so each pillar will dictate how we deal with data. So for example, there's a pillar whereby anybody can sort of buy our platform and deploy it in their own home for managing their own chronic illness. So in that way, we've certainly democratized the data from the point of view of they're in control of their data. We have no access to that data above and beyond what we need to do to support their care journey. And they have the ability to turn on and off permissions and sharing data to certain clinicians or care providers or family members. So in that world, in the world that we live in over there, we have very little control of that data. And as a result, if you were to take a composite of all of those patients that we manage from in that pillar, there's a lot of missing data. And so it becomes not very valuable. We literally have a treasure trove of 3 million data points collected over 5 years that would give us a beautiful blueprint of the cardiovascular and respiratory health of people in Ontario, and we can't leverage that data set at all. Because we stay true to the ethos that we want to democratize it. We're not going to illegally utilize that data in some way, shape, or form to benefit ourselves or monetize it. So it just sits there. It's for the patient's benefit only, and we just live with that reality. And pillar number 2, where a care institution comes to us and says, hey, we're going to deploy your platform to manage our patients. For example, our COPD cohort of patients who are very sick and elderly. We want to keep them out of the hospital. In that world, we have access to that data because we have a data sharing agreement that we deploy. And we very carefully decide what data we have access to and what we don't, so we can maintain the patient's autonomy with respect to some of their data. But that's a slippery slope because sometimes we identify problems that the patient didn't even know they have. For example, and here's a really telling example from just a few months ago. I won't name the care institution, but there was a patient who was being managed for COPD, but some of the patterns by which they used our system started to demonstrate that there was another problem going on. It turns out they're going to such severe clinical depression they were contemplating suicide. So luckily, somebody in our care support team identified this just through this bizarre, unusual pattern of behavior, called the patient, called them out on it, and we actually were able to intervene, bring them into hospital, and have their depression treated, and now they're back out in the community and thriving. So that's one of those, it's a slippery slope question where there was pieces of data there that weren't technically within the auspices of Cloud DX. Despite that fact, we felt that we had to intervene. And fortunately for us, there was no complaint on behalf of the patient or the organization that they were happy with our intervention. But it does beg the question, how far can companies like us who have access to both the data that are within the confines of our system, but ancillary data that we are sort of privy to just based on patterns of behavior, how far can we go in using that data to intervene? That's another question. I'll leave you to ask that question, Alan. But what we have learned is that in that world, care institutions, it's in their best interest to share as much data as they can, including the outcomes of the patients, because that's the only way you can empower machine learning algorithms, training them. You need to have the patient outcome data. And ironically, Douglas spoke to this, but our biggest obstacle as a company is in getting access to that data. Despite the fact that the organization is willing to share the outcome data, putting all those pieces of information together in a way that allows a company like ours to improve our algorithms is very challenging. In fact, it's the biggest challenge we face as an organization right now. We have loads of data on patients with complex medical conditions, and we have a paucity of data on their outcomes, which makes it really hard to train our algorithms.
Okay.
From our perspective, we do collect patient data, including PHI. So we comply with geographical regulations like HIPAA in the US and other regulations in other geographies. We do also sometimes have to comply with some regional regulation, whether that be state, province, or whatever. And ironically, sometimes we actually have to comply with some additional restrictions from a healthcare system or a facility that may have specific needs. One example, bearing in mind that ours is an application that takes a photograph of the wound and uses that photograph to derive information like dimensions, depth, etc. As one facility, when we started to work with them, said they did not want photographs of the wounds to be taken, which is kind of like, pew. So what we did was we had a toggle switch that basically had it turned off, but they were aware that they could turn it on at any point. Within 1 month, every single facility had turned the toggle on and was taking pictures because they realized that their own restrictions were restrictive in respect to the information they were obtaining themselves. And that as I mentioned earlier on, that most patients don't care anyway. So internally, we do manage data in very specific fashion. There's regulations and systems and processes that we must follow. And only certain individuals, mostly on our customer service side, can actually see the totality of the data. The reason they can see the totality is in case any client wants an adjustment to a record or whatever, they obviously have to get into a specific record. But for the most part, all our data scientists, et cetera, see PHI strip data. One of the situations that we came up against that we didn't foresee is even in the training that we had with clinicians, nurses, both nurses and doctors, was all of the elements of PHI that you would normally think of, like name, date of birth, etc., were easily stripped out fields. But the one thing that we didn't consider was that sometimes when the nurse or the doctor was taking a picture of the wound, they would capture a portion or the whole face of the patient, which is obviously a major issue. So when our data scientists started to look at applying algorithms, etc., and data stripping, they had to develop some algorithms that could basically look within these photographs for any partial face or full face and strip those records out. So there are unforeseen challenges that you will face on an ongoing basis, but they're like hurdles in a race. You just jump over it and get to the next one.
Awesome, awesome. And so with that, I want to actually follow up on the idea that not all data is equal. So over the last 24 hours at the Unconference, we heard from many people, both physicians and machine learning scientists, that one of the biggest challenges with data that's being used to train algorithms is the fact that it's being collected from a homogeneous population. Oftentimes, it's a population that has access to the healthcare system, has the income, speaks the language, has certain advantages over kind of some of the marginalized communities. And so the question I'd love to put to the panel is, how do you make sure that as you're training your models, you're actually capturing that information from these marginalized communities to ensure equity when these models are deployed?
I can answer that question. The truth is we can't. We have to rely on the care organization's cohort of patients, and hopefully there's a group of marginalized patients in there that'll allow our model to be better and from that perspective. But fortunately, as you grow an organization and you get opportunities, for example, we just won an RFP to deploy remote patient monitoring in the entire territory of the Yukon. And part of that RFP was your technology has to be capable of being deployed in environments like the trap line, because we have several patients living on the trap line. So now I'm salivating at that opportunity because I finally get an opportunity to look at patient data derived from a cohort of patients that are very marginalized, very remote, very inaccessible, and it's as a window to identifying what care challenges they experience and how can we use that data to inform our algorithms. So again, it's just we just have to be partnered with clinical organizations that have those types of patients at their disposal.
From our perspective, we're very fortunate. Within wound care, because there are some genetic predisposition of some marginalized communities to specific types of wounds, there are programs that are government funded for wound care in those communities, so we can access that through those programs and work with those marginalized communities. But for example, one of the things that when they developed the app was they made sure it worked offline and online, so that if there was no connectivity in any marginalized community or whatever, that the data was not lost.
Okay. Kamran, I'd love to hear kind of your thoughts on this as well, because you actually collect a lot of data, and it's not like what we heard from the other panelists, kind of personalized data.
I mean, I think I'll probably just echo what Sonny had mentioned. Is the parallel that I would draw is that in our situation, there are countries in the world that are far less developed, where there perhaps is less internet access. The media may not be quite as robust, or it may be more state-controlled. So there are certain gaps and potential biases that are introduced there. I don't know that there's anything specifically we are able to do to overcome those. These are kind of blind spots that are out there. I think just being aware of them, and particularly as we interpret the results of what we have to consider that there are certain gaps.
Yeah, great. Okay. So with that, I want to move into kind of product readiness. In terms of all of you have products that you've deployed. Sonny, we've heard from you. You tried something, it didn't work, and then you tried again. I'd love to hear about kind of what were the things that you have to do to move from this wild concept of using machine learning in healthcare to actual application? What were those kind of critical points in your journey that you can think of?
Maybe I'll start.
Yeah.
You know, as a physician who, you know, swore to uphold the Hippocratic Oath, do no harm is one of the core values in BlueDot. And I think when I founded BlueDot, we spent some time reflecting on, you know, when we would be confronting these kinds of challenges and ethical issues, we want to just ask ourselves, okay, what are the principles we're going to go back to? So I just want to start out by saying that was really important, to not just think about this from a day-to-day patient management perspective, but how am I taking this principle to the use of technology to engage with populations or individuals. So I think the first thing I guess I would say in terms of, you know, moving from a concept to implementation was really to engage our clients and our partners in the process as well, so that they could actually be able to participate, to provide input, to build trust around what the process was like. You know, when we're often talking about machine learning and we're working with people in the medical community or the public health community, you know, this whole idea that there's some algorithm that is figuring this all out, it's a complicated black box. And so I think, you know, having that engagement, so we engaged in a whole bunch of different pilots with organizations to allow them to give us feedback, to be as transparent as possible in the process. And then, of course, we did our own work in, you know, validating and testing the models to make sure that, were they working? You know, how sensitive were they? How specific were they? You know, we happen to prioritize in our work on surveillance sensitivity over specificity, so we made a conscious decision to say, well, look, if we get some false positives, it just means it's a little bit more work on our end, but if we miss something that's really important, the consequences can be quite significant. So, you know, there were a bunch of value decisions there about how we wanted to what we wanted to optimize, and then I would say, you know, continuously reassessing and reevaluating how the model is performing. And so this is one of the really great things that you know, I've been excited about with BlueDot, is to have a team that is continuously assessing the model output, and we have two individuals, two clinicians who are looking at the output, and if there is misclassification, that's going back in to feed into the model to improve its performance. So I think, you know, the things I would sort of highlight are continuously keep reassessing and engage with your clients so they have an understanding of you know, what the output of this model happens to be.
Okay. And if I could just push you on that. So at what point did you feel like, okay, we are ready to now deploy in real time? What was that critical point, and what made it happen?
Well, I think, you know, that is deploying with individual clients. What I would say is that, you know, working with one client and getting them to a point where they actually felt comfortable didn't mean that now every client would be comfortable. We'd had to go through that socialization process with each of them. But, you know, doing our own internal checks on model performance and accuracy, you know, when we did that and we felt we had reached a certain point where we were going to be capturing, you know, we had a very, very sensitive model. At that point in time, we were ready to deploy. But we also, with our clients in the early days, and we're frankly still doing this, is reminding them that the discovery process is still continuing.
I wholeheartedly agree with Cameron about, you know, engaging your stakeholders and your clients early. I can speak on, I may speak to some failures in our organization because they've informed some of our future work, whereby we, you know, the data scientists, although they're vested in clinical projects and they have a higher understanding of the clinical realm than the average data scientist, they're still not clinicians. And clinicians aren't data scientists. I kind of walk that dangerous fine line where I almost am a data scientist, but I'm not, and I'm still an active clinician, which is a very dangerous position to be in because you really don't know what you don't know yet. But our internally at Cloud DX, we have a very robust data science team led by Sarah Rossau, who's just a genius. But we've fallen victim to similar traps that other organizations have fallen into, where we just assume that they know, but they don't know that they don't know. And the clinicians assume that they know. So even it's very simple data points that we need to collect to make our product better, or to even build our product from the ground up during our product development lifecycle, critical pieces we're failing to recognize early on in the process. So we heavily focus on the user experience for both the client or the clinical organization and the patient. We heavily focus on the requirements insofar as they're approved by Health Canada and meet HIPAA regulations and ISO standards. And then we don't really work hard on that data infrastructure that we need. So subsequently, we can deploy ML algorithms seamlessly and efficiently. and some of the key data points that we needed were missing. So then we have to go back and recreate the wheel. So thankfully, we're learning from those mistakes, and I encourage you as you go on projects like that, really make sure that there's enough interaction between the clinicians and the data scientists, so you don't just assume that they know, because they don't know that they don't know.
From our perspective, we were fairly certain quite early on in the process that obviously we could take a photograph and we could take the measurements. Our initial business assumption was probably false, in the sense that we thought that that application would be a simple replacement for the measurement of wounds by paper rulers. We learned the lesson fairly quickly by the market talking back to us, primarily from the US, where the marketplace came to us and said, we have a real need for this. The two areas that really drove and changed our business trajectory was, one, that the current EMRs don't really have a good wound care component. So most of them were looking for something. So we partnered with a few of them. And the other in the US environment, where they've got quality indicators and compliance and fines for hospital-acquired pressure ulcers, et cetera, the marketplace said to us, we need this to allow us to track our compliance and our quality indicators, et cetera. So that really changed our business trajectory at that point. So my message to everyone that's participating in this, always listen to your marketplace, always listen to your customer. Don't think you've got the answer correct. You may have, but you may not.
Right. So I want to make sure we have some time for questions at the end. So I'll get to kind of the question of looking forward. I'd love to hear from all the panelists. You've all had your individual challenges in getting your idea from kind of startup to actual deployment. And looking back, what are the things that you wish that you knew at the beginning that you know now, and what would you do differently? What advice would you give to people who are just starting up now that you've been through that journey?
I think Dr. Larson, one of the medical students in the group, asked this question of him, like, what's the fundamental core training you need as a clinician in today's context? And I think having an operational understanding of data scientists, you don't need to code in Python or R, but having understanding of the tools that are available in your toolkit, so you can speak the same language and know what tool to leverage to answer your question, is critical. And I wish I'd done more background learning in data science. I mean, I went and built a tricorder, for goodness sakes, which is a very data-driven diagnostic device with no fundamental understanding of data science. That was a big failure. Thankfully, I'm learning, and now I'm actually doing online courses in data science to bring myself up to speed sort of after the fact. So I encourage those who are interested in the interface between clinical and data sciences, which I think now is a mandatory interface. It's the only way forward. You have to develop some understanding of this. So for you at the conference, this is a good place to start.
Okay. Anyone else?
From our perspective, probably that we had a clearer understanding of the customer needs at the beginning, and that we had spent more time with the customer, not only to look at their existing workflows within their environments, et cetera, but to look at the challenges that they faced on a day-to-day basis and address them as a priority rather than, as I say, drive forward our own idea.
So I think mine is going to be maybe a little different. I guess I would just say, just take a leap of faith. Because when I think of when I started this, a couple of things came to mind. What do I possibly know about running an organization or building a business? Nothing, no formal training in it whatsoever. As a clinician, many of us have been so successful in our career, the thought of a very public, epic failure wasn't exactly, something I was really excited about, knowing that, well, most startups fail, and I don't really know if I want to knock my front teeth out in front of everyone, trying this. But ultimately, it was just, look, there's a gap, there is a need, and there's an opportunity, and let's just take a leap of faith. The worst that could happen is maybe there's an epic fail, but it's kind of like when I've got twins that, one of the joys I had was recently teaching them how to ride bicycles. They're fraternal twins, and one of them said to me, one of them was like, Dad, just get away from me. You just stop running alongside me. Let me just figure this out. I realize he's probably the data scientist. The other actually said, Dad, can you write down the lists of all the steps in detail about how you ride a bike so that way, and I was like, okay, he's going to become the epidemiologist. So anyway, I think part of it is just the leap of faith. There's an opportunity with data and analytics and technology today to be doing things that are so much bigger than ourselves. I think many of us are in healthcare because we want to be impacting people's lives. So I guess I would just say is, don't be too cautious. You know, I understand there's caution needed around, the management of our patients, but take a leap of faith. There's an opportunity to do things that could change the world.
All right. So one last question before we actually open up for questions, and that is, we know that it takes a lot of help to actually pull this off, right? It takes a lot of stakeholders' involvement, clinicians, policymakers, to actually get machine learning from where it was to where it is now. So looking forward, what would you like to see from all of those different stakeholders? What are the changes that you'd hope we can work with them on to educate them or get them to the point where we can actually work together to see this partnership thrive?
I think I can contrast failed projects and success. This is a recurring theme in my talk, by the way, failure. Failed projects and successful projects, and contrast them, and how the ones that have been successful have two key components. One is the stakeholder organization, the clinical organization, the hospital or the institution or the ministry is willing to adopt a project where they accept a lot of adaptability and flexibility. They understand that machine learning is a novel approach to solving fundamental problems in healthcare, and that there's going to be a lot of learning and informing, and you can't have a rigid set of requirements by which you have to deploy a project and operationalize it. It's going to fail. So that means two things. There's got to be an internal champion who is a very moonshot type thinking, just like Cameron thought, you take the leap of faith. There's got to be a leap of faith with the technology. And number two, be willing to adapt and be flexible as you go. Otherwise, it's going to fail. You won't reach the desired outcome.
Yeah, I would echo that. And I think that certainly if one looks at healthcare systems across the world, they're all supposedly cash strapped. And as a consequence of that, they make cuts in different areas, etc., usually blindly. So what I'd echo to them is that what machine learning and big data can actually give to them is information to make much more informed decisions, but more importantly, make much more efficient processes to date that can actually deliver more healthcare for the cash-strapped budget that they have.
I think I'm just going to bold and underline what Sonny said, because that really resonated with me. You know, many innovators are out there taking, again, that leap of faith and, taking risks to try and do things in a way that is different, but perhaps better. And what I would really ask is hospitals and government health agencies meet us halfway, because it feels to me like, if we want to talk about complexity, and we've spent lots of discussions about machine learning, that's the easy part. Just think about procurement for a hospital, and if you want to talk complicated, that's where you're going to fail. So the question is, are institutions and hospitals, what are we doing here? Are we talking about connecting these into institutions? Are they going to take the leap of faith, meet us halfway, and say, we want to support Canadian innovators, knowing that the process is messy? It is not going to be a clean, straight line. This is going to be a messy path, but can we go through the discovery together in recognizing that we can get to a much better place? I think many Canadian innovators find that the Canadian market is really difficult, and that we're often pursuing stuff. I'll be just honest, BlueDot is overwhelmingly working outside of Canada, because it's such an uphill battle. So my comment would be, hospitals and health agencies and institutions, meet us halfway, and let's work on these things together. But right now, it's such an uphill battle that it's kind of difficult to envision how we're going to actually be able to scale and grow these technologies domestically.
All right. With that, we want to open up to questions from the audience.
Just want to push on Cameron a little bit, and you, Sonny. If you had a wish list for the health system or the hospitals specifically, because they've said they want to get out of the way, what exactly do you want them to do? What would be the top 3 things that you would want a CEO to ensure happens to enable what you're talking about?
So I think, one, have an internal champion that is dedicated toward innovation, because right now it's not even clear who's the decision maker, who do you go talk to. Second, make the pathway to procurement a little bit more clear. It's about as murky as you can possibly imagine. I mean, I think those would be two key things. And then also just from a cultural standpoint, recognize that the decision-making from the executive and leadership level is that this inherently will be messy. It's not going to just go and become perfect right out of the gates. And so I think those are, in my mind, three things that would make this a lot easier. To the fact that we're doing this really in a partnership as opposed to just selling something.
Yeah, I would agree with Cameron. I think it's interesting. I think the market dynamics of our current care institutions that are OHIP and ministry funded have created an environment where there's not a lot of innovation happening. For example, you know, everybody knows a story about Netflix and Blockbuster. The Blockbuster CEO being asked about Netflix on a CNN interview and asked literally point blank, "What do you think of Netflix?" They're not even on our radar. 2 years later, Blockbuster was bankrupt, didn't exist anymore. We don't have those same pressures on our institutions, our care institutions. Whether they operate at surplus or at a deficit, it does not matter. They're here to stay. They get their budgets and they operate. So they don't have those same driving pressures that really foster innovation. But there are internal pressures within an organization that we could solve. And so if you open your doors for us, we're happily willing to, as Cameron said, meet you halfway, help you solve some of those problems. It'll be messy. We got to get our feet wet and our hands dirty, but we've done it. We found an internal champion at a neighboring hospital in the GTA, and we solved their problem. We drove down their admissions to hospital for COPD by 80% and their ER visits by 40%. And luckily for us, that institution found a way around that I won't even call it a black box that is procurement, their black hole that is procurement. They got their way around it, and we quickly moved from successful pilot, board approval, no procurement, standard of care. And so luckily there's been an organization, a large hospital in the GTA that found a way around procurement, and I'm hoping that sets a trend.
Am I on? Yep. I'm on. Hypothetical question, and it's regarding an ethical matter. If you have a client, all of this information can be used to improve care, but if you look at a for-profit healthcare system, like in the States, where there is a premium, an organizational premium on denying service. Do you see a risk, and do you have a responsibility to do something about the risk of that kind of information being used in that fashion?
From our perspective, since 95% of our business is in the US, it is an issue that we are aware of. Fortunately for us, because wounds are a secondary consequence of some underlying comorbidity, the payer usually has more information regarding that patient's comorbidities than obviously we have. We see it, however, as a learning opportunity, because one of the things that payers don't have a lot of information on is wounds. And they do make some blind decisions to the detriment of patients. And what we are hoping through the information that we gather and working with some of those payer organizations who are also interested in having a component within their payer system data collection to have a wound component, that they'll actually become educated and make much more informed decisions than actually deny patients the care that they deserve.
Other? Yes. Back.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Danilo from Trillium Health Partners, and I have a question around talent. So a lot of hospitals work in very rigid job codes, and is it trying to build this capacity of big data and machine learning within their own system? What recommendations do you have around what do you look for in a talent? How do you attract it, and how do you retain it?
That's a great question. We certainly face that at Cloud DX. We're based in Kitchener-Waterloo, but we're across the street from Google and Microsoft, so we face that battle every day. The incumbents coming out of Conestoga College and Waterloo and Laurier, they're all great and young and vibrant, have great ideas, and they get picked off by the Shopifys and the Googles, and off they go to Silicon Valley, and we lose them. And that's after they've done their co-ops with us. So we've certainly faced that pain internally. The one thing I would say is they sort of pre-select themselves from the point of view of if you're in pitches, we can't offer you as much stock, we can't pay you as much. But you're solving real world problems that have a context that's beyond us. It's a clinical one, you know, and the way we put that into context is, hey, you, Mr. New Developer, can you accompany Kara, our customer support specialist, to Mrs. So-and-so's house? Because she's having some issue with her tablet and interfacing with her devices to manage her heart failure. And off he goes, just to learn, see what's happening in the field. And Mrs. So-and-so gives him the biggest hug and says, you saved my life last week. I had bradycardia due to hyperkalemia. I didn't even know it. I didn't even feel it. But my heart rate went to 20 or 30, and I was like, something's up. I called my daughter. My daughter took me in the hospital. My potassium was 8. I was like minutes away from death. And all of a sudden, that developer's like, you know what? This meant something to me outside of my cubicle. So I think if you contextualize the opportunities, they'll jump. And if they do jump, that's the type of person you want in an organization. If they don't jump, no matter their talent level, you don't want them anyway.
I think maybe I'll just add to that. You know, I think the conclusion I've come to is that there are multiple currencies that are important to your staff and your employees, and some of them are financial currencies, what their compensation is, and others are people wanting to be doing something that's bigger than themselves. And so that can be a big draw. And I think, you know, a small organization has to play to its strengths to be able to compete with these other larger organizations. So I think, you know, a couple of things that we've really done is put out there, you know, what's our mission, what are our values, so that we're really attracting talent that are aligned with those values. Another thing we've done in the organization is really early on hired a people and culture director, someone whose job is just focusing on people, their personal growth, so that the company is working for the employees as much as the employees are working for the company's mission. Now you've got a balanced, you know, relationship here. And so that was one of the things that we did to minimize attrition, so that everyone knows we are working for you and you're helping the organization grow and realize its goals and objectives.
So, all right. With that, I think we've actually run out of time. So help me in thanking the panelists once again.